New Corbyn, new confusion on both Brexit and capping fat cat earnings. Good evening. It was to have been the relaunch of the Corbyn brand, but the day ended in disarray, with few in the party clear about what the party's policy actually is on the free movement of people and on capping earnings. Tonight, we try to find out and ask, what now for the state of the Labour Party's leadership amid the Brexit crisis?
Also tonight, new figures show the number of elderly patients waiting 12 hours or more in A&E has more than doubled in 2 years, as the Health Secretary refuses to say whether he meant what he said yesterday about changing the waiting time targets. The winter crisis continues.
You know, when you imagine the word chaos, that's what it was like. There was people sat around on the floors, there was like asleep on the floors, there was outside the waiting room.
A 15-year-old girl is in custody after 7-year-old Katie Ruff was found severely injured in York and later died. And...
Dear friends, USA!
Trump's confirmation hearings begin with angry protests against his nominee for Attorney General.
And Claire Hollingworth, who achieved perhaps the greatest journalistic scoop of the 20th century, dies at 105.
I was driving back along a valley and saw scores, if not hundreds, of tanks. 3 days later, on the 1st of September, the tanks rolled in.
She it was who, whilst ostensibly buying wine and aspirin on the German-Polish border in 1939, spotted what proved to be the opening moments of the Second World War. It was billed as Jeremy Corbyn's vision for post-Brexit Britain, signalling Labour's willingness to accept curbs on EU immigration as part of any deal. But by the time he'd arrived at Peterborough to deliver the speech, the pledge had been watered down. So too had a plan he'd flagged up only this morning for a cap on top people's pay that would apply only to firms winning government contracts, with a series of lesser options listed for curbing executive pay in private companies. Our political editor Gary Gibbon went to watch the speech.
Peterborough voted 60% for Brexit, a victory fuelled by local concerns about immigration. Labour suggested Jeremy Corbyn was coming here to qualify his long-standing pro-immigration stance, reach out to voters nervous of Labour in a seat the party held until a decade ago.
I probably trust Theresa May stronger than Jeremy Corbyn on that.
On immigration?
Yes, on immigration.
And that could affect the way you vote?
Certainly.
Well, I like him, but one or two of his views are a little bit iffy.
On what sort of subject?
Immigration.
You're in favour of more immigration control?
No, yes.
And you think he's, from your point of view, soft on immigration?
Yes.
But Jeremy Corbyn slightly ambushed his own speech on Europe. His aides have decided they want him to do more attention-grabbing policies through this year. And this morning, in an interview, he recommitted himself to capping top salaries. There were no numbers, no discussion with colleagues beforehand. But around here, quite a lot of instinctive approval.
Good idea?
Yeah.
That appeals to you?
Yeah, because people earn too much money.
Yeah, I've just heard that on the radio, actually, yeah, I agree with that.
Is that appealing?
Yeah.
Does that make you think of Jeremy Corbyn, that you'll listen to him a bit more?
I do listen to him, yeah. He does stand out.
In his speech, Jeremy Corbyn spelled out that he actually wanted to cap the ratio of average and top pay in a company. Companies that paid their bosses more than 20 times average pay wouldn't get government contracts.
A 20-to-1 ratio means someone earning the living wage, just over $16,000 a year, would permit an executive to be earning nearly $350,000. It cannot be right that if companies are getting public money, that they can be creamed off by a few at the top.
Aides said that kind of rule would breach EU law, and that was evidence of some good things that Brexit could bring. The speech on Europe was in part a response from Jeremy Corbyn's team to pressure from others in the Labour Party, suggesting Labour needs to be tougher in its immigration message in the Brexit debate. But even close allies of Jeremy Corbyn admit when it came to the detail in the speech, this was more a change of language than policy.
We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out.
Something for everyone there. Jeremy Corbyn's long been passionately pro-immigration and doesn't sound ready to abandon that just yet.
Would you rule out bringing in work visas for EU citizens?
We have to go into the negotiations. The crucial thing has to be to maintain the market access with Europe and take it from there.
Would you like to see immigration fall over the next 5 years? Would that be desirable from your point of view?
As far as I'm concerned, we have migration into this country, and the migrants that have come here have made an enormous effort and worked very hard. Without them, our health service wouldn't survive. Without them, education would be in trouble. Without them, transport would be in trouble.
One lone pro-Brexit supporter heckled his departure.
An anti-Brexit message. And why have you backtracked on your immigration?
Jeremy Corbyn didn't really make peace with this Brexit stronghold today, but he caught voters' attention, and after a few months of getting overlooked, his team will be glad of that. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Peterborough.
Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to the UKIP MEP, Patrick O'Flynn. But first, we're joined from Westminster by Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Clive Lewis. Clive Lewis, did Labour's immigration policy change today?
I think what's come out today is that there's clarity on what our negotiating position or pre-negotiating position would be, and it will be in the coming weeks and months as we approach the end of March. What we're saying is that we're not wedded to the principle of the freedom movement of labour, of people, nor do I think we should be wedded to the principle of the freedom movement of capital. There are four clear freedoms, so to speak, in the EU: goods, services, people and capital. And I think what we've done here today, I think it's been quite clear that our main priority is access, tariff-free access if possible, but the best possible access we can get to the single market. It's about jobs and living conditions. And we don't want to tie ourselves down by saying that we will commit unreservedly to those four principles, including this one. So I think that's the key. That's the key that's come out today, the key thing.
Well, this is the sentence that in Mr Corbyn's speech that was released to us in the media. Labour is not wedded to freedom of movement for EU citizens as a point of principle. But what did Mr Corbyn say? He said Labour is not wedded to freedom of movement for EU citizens as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misrepresented, nor do we rule it out. Well, I mean, has somebody doctored his autocue? It happened to you in the past.
I think, look, when people voted for Brexit, they voted for a number of reasons, and it wasn't simply down to the issue of freedom of movement, as important as that is. I think what we have to also understand here is that once and if Article 50 is triggered, the positions of Theresa May, of Jeremy Corbyn and everyone else, in many ways, becomes pretty irrelevant, because ultimately what's going to happen is that 27 EU member states are going to decide what the deal is that we get. Nonetheless, we need to negotiate. We need to negotiate with them, and to do that, we've been quite clear to say that when we do negotiate with you, our priority is access, jobs, the economy to the single market. That's the priority. And on the other side of it, if we can have a free and fair immigration policy on freedom of movement, then we will have that as well. It's a sliding scale, and I don't think it's a binary choice. Most people understand, whether it's the NHS, whether it's skilled jobs, whether it's semi-skilled jobs, that we need migration in an international, global economy.
Well,
you can't put the barriers up overnight.
There is a little problem, and that is that quite important people in your own party are calling for clarity on this thing. And it sounds very unclear. And you may say that the Labour Party has no say in whatever goes on with the 27 in the negotiation. But the truth of the matter is people need to know what you stand for at the moment at which Britain is having to do this.
Well, and we're not going to go down the path of Theresa May, who has said her red line is freedom of movement and immigration. We're not going to do that. We're not saying that. What we're saying, our red line, quite clearly, is making sure that we get the best possible deal in terms of access to the single market, to make sure that our economy can continue to run and to prosper and to thrive, and that we have inward investment, not that we have a hard Brexit and crash the economy. Theresa May has started from the wrong position. We're starting from the right position. I think that's quite clear, and I think that's the right thing to do.
OK, well, but the same thing sort of applies to this whole question of whether you're going to cap pay. I mean, that also seems to be unclear. That, again, the day started with Mr Corbyn suddenly announcing this desire to cap excessive pay, and then suddenly it became, well, the excessive pay of people who are doing business with the state.
Yeah, well, so if you have I think he went on to talk about pay ratios as a possibility. We're going through an industrial strategy at the moment. If you have a pay ratio, you are in effect capping, because the bottom level of pay will have to be limited by a ratio. 20-1 was mentioned by Jeremy Corbyn in his speech. It was also mentioned by David Cameron earlier on. I think the issue, as your report shows that today we've got people talking about an issue of real concern to people. That's for the past 20, 30 years. Top pay in this country has rocketed. It hasn't been a trickle down in terms of top pay and allowing the wealthiest to become ever wealthier. It's been a flood up. And you saw in that report, people said, actually, I quite like the idea of seeing some kind of limit on how much people are paid. People want to see...
And that would be for everybody. For everybody, or what? I mean, of course, some of the most excessive pay is with people who don't do business with the state, some of the banks and the rest of it.
That was one of the options, but there are other ways. So, for example, one of the ideas that was floated there, and it's one that I've got a particular preference for, is that we have workers, the majority of workers on remuneration boards, who can have a real say, real teeth in basically being able to say to the company, to the boss, this is the level of pay which we feel you deserve with your performance. I think that's a good idea. That was floated today. I think that's something that we will look at. We've got an industrial strategy going on. We'll be talking to lots of people, and I think that's an idea that many people at home will think is a relatively good one.
Clive Lewis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, now, as I said, we've got Patrick O'Flynn from the UKIP party. It seems to be mixed news for you today. On the one hand, you will be pleased with the question of fudge on the immigration policy, but on the fat cap pay, you don't like that at all. You don't want to cap anybody's pay, do you?
Well, if we deal with those in order, the Labour leaders, spin doctors last night, were very much pushing that this speech was going to be the moment where Jeremy Corbyn spoke out in favour of nation-state border controls. I view it a bit like a racehorse being pushed unwillingly into the starting stalls. The stalls have pinged open and the horse hasn't moved. He couldn't do it. And I say that's because he doesn't believe in the nation-state as the fundamental.
Well, that's where you hope to pick up a lot of Labour votes.
And, well, in his speech, he immediately bridged very quickly into more NHS spending. And, you know, one interesting thing, he did admit in the speech that stopping paying EU contributions will help potentially to fund
would
the NHS.
you spend more on the health service?
We absolutely would, yes, and that's what UKIP's manifesto said. We would use £3 billion a year, independently costed and verified, from the EU contributions.
That, of course, was going to be for the contribution to the EU, but as you know, a lot of that has to go on all the grants to farmers and the rest of it who are going to be deprived of what was coming in from the EU.
We're talking about very large net contribution, but it is fair to say that that Brexit is taking some time, and that money is not available yet. So Jeremy Corbyn has a point, and you know, so does everyone else who cares about the health service, that there's a funding challenge.
Well,
and we will be making an offer in due course on that as well. We're going to be competing on the health playing field a lot more strongly than Jeremy Corbyn was competing on immigration.
Well, the polls show that Labour does well on health, you less well. You do well on immigration and freedom of movement, but fat cap pay. Now, that is popular with the workers. They don't like, and why should they like, massive pay deals for the people that run their companies. But you're quite friendly towards that.
No, actually, in our last manifesto, we addressed lots of issues to do with the excesses of the multinational corporations.
So you'd like to see a cap on fat cap
Well,
pay?
he's right to identify this issue of the ratios between boardroom and executive pay.
So your erstwhile mass donor, you'd like to see him capped?
I don't know which erstwhile mass donor you're
the biggest of your
about.
donors.
Well, believe it or not, that's a bit of a contested position, who's been our biggest donor over the long term. But
anyway, I mean, would they be capped?
Well,
that's the question.
To use that old Alistair Campbell phrase about the many, not the few, I think there is an issue about creating an economy, I would say, that works for the many as well as the few, and we will be making our own offer in due course on that as well. I think a maximum wage...
Let's leave that ringing in the ears of the voter.
Maximum wage sounds like Jimmy Hill and professional football 50 years ago. Bit old-fashioned.
Paul O'Flynn, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Christian.
Now, ministers have appealed to nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland to come together to avert a looming political crisis. The Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire, told MPs that the resignation of Sinn Féin's Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, in a row over a botched heating project would almost certainly mean a snap general election. And even that may not resolve the crisis. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is in Belfast. Alex.
Well, yes, this building behind me has seen some historic changes in terms of power sharing, so let's talk a little history. Time was 1974. Power sharing ended here because of widespread violence and brutality during the Ulster workers' strike. Well, that was then. This is now 2017, and power sharing ends because of a dispute on the face of it over incentives given to small businesses and farmers over using renewable fuels. Yeah, well, some may say that shows how far politics has progressed here and normalised perhaps in a couple of generations. That is progress, that is good. But, and it's a big but, underlying that actual immediate issue lie an awful lot of things which are embedded in the old frustrations, the old anger and the old mistrust of the old politics here. The longest period of devolved government in Northern Ireland has fallen apart in bitterness and recrimination. Now the clock ticks. If they can't cut a deal, and soon, Northern Ireland's voters face not one but several elections.
As things stand, therefore, an early Assembly election looks highly likely. I should add that once an election has been held, the rules state that the Assembly must meet again within 1 week, with a further 2-week period to form a new executive. Should this not be achieved then, as things currently stand, I am obliged to call another election.
But given the still divisive and sectarian nature of politics here, in reality, Westminster would simply impose direct rule on Northern Ireland, probably for a considerable time. Late this afternoon in Belfast, the now deposed First Minister, Arlene Foster, said she remains open for talks with all parties.
The DUP has not given up or walked away. We want truth, transparency and cost control, even though others would rather play high-stakes politics with Northern Ireland's stability.
Superficial smiles, but in fact the relationship between Unionist First Minister and Republican Deputy had become toxic. Martin McGuinness's resignation letter attacked the attitude of Arlene Foster's DUP on women, LGBT and Irish language before he even mentioned the actual resignation issue.
Whatever anyone thinks of Martin McGuinness, most people would accept that he bent body and soul, broke his back in 10 years in that office to make it work, to reach out, to be tolerant and to be respectful and to be treating everybody in a fair way. So he would not have moved to the position that he moved to if there was any other option.
And Sinn Féin repeating tonight they will not be filling Martin McGuinness's post as Deputy First Minister. Therefore, an election is on. But out in the Unionist Shankill and Nationalist Falls area of this city, what do you know? Agreement. They don't fancy an election at all.
I don't think we need an election, so we don't, because it's just going to come back to a status quo. You know, people will vote along the same lines.
Won't make any difference. Still go the same way. We'll still vote the same.
Could be just a return of the old guard, but you'd like to think that people would use their heads this time and use their vote to change.
Nothing changes, they say, but one big thing has changed, and it's politics that changed it. It's called peace.
As of this moment, the spectre of gun isn't there, or bomb. Now, there is no appetite in this community on any side for guns and bombs. I think that is a constant at this moment in time. You cannot read into the future. That's going to be for another time. But at this moment in time, we are, thank the Lord, free of that awful history through which we lived for so long.
And that's not a small reality to bear in mind in the coming long uncertainty here. So that's an optimistic thought perhaps to end with, but where do we go? Well, it's going to be a bit like this. Nobody knows for sure, but we've had one or two clues. Secretary of State has about 7 days to try and get a deal. Looks almost impossible, you have to say, tonight. Then it's an election the deposed First Minister herself described tonight as being brutal. And it hasn't even started yet, much less even been called, but it probably will happen. After that, as they say here in Belfast, the dogs on the street know that the result will probably be a similar assembly to the one we've got now, and that ultimately means direct rule, and quite a lot of it for a substantial period of time. Back to you.
Alex Thompson in Belfast. The government continues to deny it's a crisis, but new figures from the Health Service Information Centre, NHS Digital, show that the number of elderly people waiting for more than 12 hours in A&E departments in England has more than doubled in the last 2 years, and hospitals are feeling the strain of growing demands this winter. Paul McNamara reports now from Hull, where operations have been cancelled, patients have been urged to stay away from A&E unless they are seriously ill.
The NHS has just had the busiest day in its entire history, and across the country it doesn't show signs of slowing down. New figures released today reveal the effect on patients at the sharp end as hospitals struggle with ever-increasing demand.
Until now, this hospital and the local doctors have all been coping well with the winter influx, indeed better than many across the country. But there was only so much pressure that could be applied to all points of the local health service before something has to give. And right now, it seems that Hull and East Yorkshire hospitals have reached that point.
Louise discovered that firsthand last night after a severe asthma attack.
You imagine the word chaos. That's what it was like. There was people sat around on the floors. There was like asleep on the floors. There was outside the waiting room. It was horrendously busy last night.
Louise spent 12 hours in A&E, an A&E that she'd rushed to many times before.
Is that the busiest you've ever seen?
Ever, yeah, and I've been a few times to A&E.
And then the staff, how were they
The staff, I mean, I feel sorry for the staff. They was really good. They was trying to get through, but there's only so much you can do if there's no space to put anyone.
If you could have gone anywhere else, would you have?
I tried my own GP. I rang the NHS to see what the advice they'd give me, and they all advised me to go to A&E.
Louise's experience is not unique. Figures released today reveal the number of people waiting on a trolley for more than 12 hours has doubled from 87,000 to more than 185,000 in just 2 years. The number of elderly people left waiting for half a day has more than doubled from 34,000 to 88,000. And of those, 56,000 patients were over 80 years old. That's just the picture in England. It's not much better in Wales.
Yet the Vice President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in Wales yesterday described current performance here as bad, if not worse, than England.
And in Scotland, more patients are waiting longer than 4 hours in A&Es too. Across the nation, hospitals are appealing to patients to stay home unless it really is an emergency. This leaked email from Mid-Essex Hospital Trust reveals plans to cancel non-emergency operations and look for ways to send any possible patients home. Yesterday, the Health Secretary said 30% of those showing up at casualties weren't emergencies and shouldn't be there, although 2 years ago he admitted to doing it himself.
I've taken my own children to an A&E department at the weekend precisely because I didn't want to wait until later on to take them to see a GP. And I think we have to recognise that society is changing and people don't always know whether the care that they need is urgent or whether it's an emergency.
Today, however, he didn't appear to want to talk about anything.
This one is the end of the 4-hour waiting times.
Even to clarify confusion about whether he plans to waver on the commitment that all emergency patients are seen within 4 hours. Queues at A&E, though, are just a very stark snapshot of an entire system overstretched, according to critics. Historically, the toughest weeks for the NHS are the 3 weeks approaching. We may yet to see the worst.
Well, I'm joined now from Leeds by Dr. Taj Hassan, President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. How would you describe the crisis in our A&E departments at the moment?
Good evening. Thank you. I think the package that you've just delivered describes the situation very well. Our emergency care systems, our emergency departments and our hospitals are in a state, unfortunately, of acute distress. We're doing all we can. Our staff in our emergency departments as well as elsewhere are working probably at the very limits of their abilities at times. And we've been predicting this. We predicted it back in September that unfortunately we were entering the winter in the worst possible state, the worst probably in over 12 years. And that has unfortunately come to pass.
Now, yesterday, the Health Secretary suggested that the real problem was people who didn't really need to be at A&E at all and sort of blamed the public for clogging up the waiting rooms. But today's figures seem to suggest that the problem is about more serious patients waiting on trolleys for 12 hours or more to be moved on into the hospitals.
Yes, I mean, we were interested by Secretary of State's comments yesterday. He's right in the sense that people with minor illness have certainly increased in recent years due to failures in the wider primary care system. But actually, the number one issue, number 1, 2 and 3, are the patients who are waiting, who are ill or significantly injured, who are waiting to get a bed in a hospital. And the reason that they can't is because our hospital beds are crowded with patients who unfortunately are fit for transfer out into the community, but there are no community beds for them because of poor social care funding. So we need social care funds, we need acute hospital beds, and we need more staff in our emergency departments to cope with the increased demand that he quite rightly identifies.
So do you agree with the Red Cross, who flagged this whole issue of people not being able to go home because the social care system is in crisis? I mean, they called it a humanitarian crisis.
Well, they did call it a humanitarian crisis, and that's very emotional language. All I can certainly say to you is that all of our systems are acutely distressed. Our staff are distressed. I was working a late shift last week where, you know, I had staff really at the very limits of their abilities asking me what I was going to do about it. And all I can do is to speak the truth about what we think needs to happen. We've had some very good discussions with Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, as well as Jim Mackey. We've identified some short-term measures that we think will help stabilise the situation, and we've identified some early proposals that we'd like to put to colleagues at the Department of Health that we think in the medium term will stop the patch-fix solutions and instead create stability and quality for our patients.
Dr. Hassan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, a 7-year-old girl who died after being found severely injured has been named by North Yorkshire Police tonight. Katie Ruff was found in a playing field in the Woodthorpe area of York. A 15-year-old girl was later arrested and is still in police custody this evening. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni, is at the scene. Tell us more, Darshna.
An extremely distressing story is emerging here, John. We're on the outskirts of York, in an affluent area, on a cul-de-sac of red brick detached houses that back onto playing fields. And behind me, where the police van is an alleyway leading to those fields, and that's where the incident happened. It was yesterday afternoon at around 4 o'clock when children were walking home from school. And we're told that Katie Ruff's mother received a call to say that an incident had happened. She drove here from the family home, and neighbours say that what happened next was very upsetting. They say that Katie's mother found her daughter in the alley with severe injuries. She was crying and pleading with them to call an ambulance, apparently saying that her little girl had been hurt. And this is how one neighbour here described to me what happened.
A woman ran up the street. That was obviously the mother of the daughter. She was shouting help, called for an ambulance. So I put my shoes on and went to go up the alleyway. And I got halfway up and I could see a body lying in the field, but the police were already there attending. And the mother was with them.
Darshna, what has been the police response?
Well, the 15-year-old girl was arrested soon after the incident, and she has spent the day in custody. Now, given her age, there are obviously strict rules that apply to, for example, who can be present when she's questioned, how long she can be questioned for. And given the sensitivities, detectives haven't released much information today. They have only said tonight that she is still in custody. Initially, the police team that dealt with the incident tweeted about how distressing it had been. They said it had been a difficult day for all those who dealt with it, with the death of the 7-year-old girl. And they said that their thoughts were with Katie's family. Today, her grandparents came here to lay flowers, and they left a card saying, "Night, night to our Princess Katie." And tonight, the police, John, have asked anyone who may have seen the two girls together here to come forward.
Darshna Soni in York. Now to Washington, where the approaching Trump presidency continues to take shape, with a Senate committee beginning confirmation hearings for his cabinet appointees. They started today with Jeff Sessions, the man Mr. Trump wants as his Attorney General. But the controversial Alabama senator was facing a tough grilling from his erstwhile colleagues. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now. So how's it been going, Kylie?
Well, it's been lively, John. Standing room only for this hearing on the Hill, as you might expect. We crammed in with everyone else for our first glimpse of Trumpism in action, really, and the first of the president-elect's nominees to actually face congressional scrutiny. As well as that, there were frequent interruptions from protesters scattered among the audience, enraged by their belief that this is a racist being put in charge of the American legal system, allegations that Senator Sessions forcefully rejected. The weight of history hung heavily over today's confirmation hearing. John F. Kennedy appointed his brother Attorney General to wield the nation's laws. As the good senator from Alabama took the oath, there were those who questioned whether this conservative Trump loyalist would use his power to serve the president or the people. His answer? He'd serve the country.
I've always loved the law. It is the very foundation of this country. It is the exceptional foundation of America.
It's not the first time Jefferson Beauregard Sessions has faced a confirmation hearing.
I am not a racist. I am not insensitive to blacks. I have supported civil rights activity in my state.
Today, on the cusp of becoming the nation's Attorney General, he faced allegations of racism again.
I was accused in 1986 of failing to protect the voting rights of African Americans and of condemning civil rights advocates and organizations, and even harboring, amazingly, sympathies for the KKK. Well, I abhor the Klan and what it represents and its hateful ideology.
As a senator, Jeff Sessions has played the role of a conservative gatekeeper. He voted against the Hate Crimes Protection Act, against the Violence Against Women Act, against bipartisan immigration reform. Protesters today interrupted the hearing, urging the committee to consider his voting record and stand on the right side of history.
No Trump! No KKK! No fascist USA! No Trump!
This is the dawning of the age of Donald Trump and his Republican Party. So despite the protests of law professors, of civil rights groups, of women's rights groups, of immigrants' rights groups, Jeff Sessions will become the next Attorney General. And the first thing on his agenda, defending the police and tackling crime.
The law enforcement members that are here today, would you please stand?
The senator staged some hearing theatrics of his own, with a simple gesture reassuring law enforcement across the country that his Justice Department would prioritise defending rather than investigating them.
We need to be sure that when we criticize law officers, it is narrowly focused on the right basis for criticism, and to smear whole departments places those officers at greater risk.
That's a reversal of the Justice Department response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and it didn't go unnoticed. Activists warning Sessions will undo the progress that's been made.
Mr. Sessions will be starting quite a deficit in those areas. I do not believe people would trust that he would fully enforce the law and actually advocate on behalf of racial and ethnic minorities in our country.
Senator Sessions was careful to stay neutral on some of the president-elect's more extreme proposals, like a ban on Muslims, but also signalled that with Donald Trump in charge, change is coming. So the hearing isn't over yet, but Jeff Sessions will be confirmed, as indeed will all the appointees of Donald Trump. The Democrats simply don't have the numbers to cause him any problems. We will hear from the current president later tonight. For the last time, Barack Obama will make his final address in Chicago. A huge audience is expected there. There's been a real rush for tickets, reflecting his popularity as he departs office. In his speech, the president, we're told, will try to rally the spirits of progressives. The message is likely to be a hopeful vision for the future of a nation that he maintains benefits from diversity and fairness. And to round out the day, the president-elect Donald Trump has just confirmed again that he will act immediately to repeal Barack Obama's crowning achievement, the Affordable Care Act. As yet, no health care replacement has been designed, but President-elect Trump says that's no reason to delay. So the changes are coming thick and fast.
Kylie Morris. Well, Boris Johnson has just returned from his trip to Washington to make contact with the new administration, fired up by their apparent enthusiasm for a trade deal with the UK. The Foreign Secretary also met Republican leaders in Congress who will play a vital role in any negotiations. Mr. Johnson told the Commons he thought a deal could now come quickly.
I have to say to the House that there's a huge fund of goodwill for the United Kingdom on Capitol Hill, and a very large measure of understanding that now is the time to do a free trade deal. They want to do it. They want to do it fast, and that understanding was most vivid and most urgent on the part of the incoming administration.
Well, our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is with me. We don't have a trade deal with the US. Why is it such a big deal?
Look, trade is at the heart of every healthy economy, and quite frankly, here in the UK, we've been underperforming for years. David Cameron had this lofty ideal that we'd have £1 trillion worth of exports by 2020, but in fact, we've been languishing at half that amount for the last 4 years. That's what makes the US arrangement so important. America represents the biggest single export destination. We exported £47.3 billion worth of goods to them. That adds up to 16.4% of all of our exports. Compare that to Germany, where we export more than £30 billion. Yes, it's a big number, but you'd have to add up all of our German exports and all of our French exports to come to the same quantum. Now, it is a different picture when you look at imports, because here in Britain, we buy a lot of German goods. In fact, we buy £61.7 billion worth, whereas US imports come in third after Germany and China.
So do we care more about Germany or America then?
Well, it's a bit of a nonsense to say this. We have to have good trade relationships with both Germany and America to have a healthy economy. But with Germany, we have a trade deficit. So theoretically, we are more important to the German economy than the other way around. That could give us the upper hand in trade negotiations, because when it comes to US, we have a trade surplus. While we have exports that are worth 16.4% of all of our exports to the US, that's a very big number. When it comes to US exports to the UK, it's just 3.7%, small number. And earlier today, I was speaking to a former trade minister who said, listen, don't forget that at the heart of things, America is incredibly protectionist. So all this talk of a special relationship has never been to do with trade, and probably never will. We might have been catapulted to the front of the queue under Trump, but negotiations when it comes to trade will always be difficult with the US.
Thanks, Helia. John.
It has been another day of industrial action affecting transport services. BA flights from Heathrow were disrupted when cabin staff launched a 2-day walkout, and the long-running Southern Railways dispute saw hundreds of thousands of passengers left without services yet again as drivers began further strikes. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has this.
Welcome to Brighton, so the sign says. Just don't expect to get any trains from here. No Southern trains, that is. Early morning, and they're all lined up and switched off as train drivers go out on strike again over changes to their role.
It's really frustrating, and it's even worse trying to get home. It's just, it takes hours.
It's been a nightmare, you know. It's a 3-hour journey by National Express, but at least I know I'll get there.
More than 250,000 people travel on Southern daily, yet 8 months on and there's no resolution in sight. Today, just a handful of trains, including this one, in operation. Southern has insisted drivers, not conductors, close the door on its trains. Although there still will be onboard supervisors, the unions say those roles will be phased out and passengers' safety compromised. Can you guarantee then that there will be an onboard supervisor, the conductor role as was, on every single Southern train?
We are recruiting 100 more people so that we can meet that commitment of rostering a second person on every single train.
On every single train?
Where there was previously a conductor.
It's not clear how many Southern trains will operate with a driver and a supervisor.
No, I can be very clear. I can tell you how many that is. That's 900 trains a day.
Out of how many trains a day then?
About 2,242 trains that we run a day.
In other words, about 40%, though the unions aren't convinced.
We'll be happy with a safe method of working. People keep talking about modernisation. This isn't modernisation. Introducing newer, longer trains using outdated technology and not looking at what people have to do as a consequence of it isn't modernisation. It's actually a race to the bottom and making things inherently unsafe.
From trains to planes, over at Heathrow, cabin crew on newer contracts with a basic salary of just over £12,000 were striking over what they call poverty pay, having rejected BA's latest pay offer.
I think it's an insult to us, an insult to our branch, an insult to our members, an insult to the crew community. We are the future of the airline, and if they don't keep us happy, then they're not going to have an airline to keep going.
Despite the walkout, BA says flights departed as planned today, though 22 were cancelled. It said cabin crew earn more than £21,000 based on pay, allowances and bonuses.
From the angry cabin crew at Heathrow here behind me to the ongoing bitter dispute with Southern Rail to striking postal workers and bus drivers, there's a spate of industrial action spreading across Great Britain. But the question is, are these strikes merely coincidental, or is there something bigger happening?
Today, a ballot at Northern Rail could see strikes by the end of the month, while unions for post office workers threatened more action after 27 further high street branches were closed with the loss of 300 jobs. Battle lines across the country are being drawn.
Now, let's return to tonight's main news, Jeremy Corbyn's plans to curb high salaries. He spoke of about a 20-to-1 pay ratio in the public sector introduced by David Cameron to limit salaries in the public sector to £150,000. Well, Jeremy Corbyn said Labour would go further.
We'll go further and extend that to any company that is awarded a government contract. A 20-to-1 ratio means someone earning the living wage, just over £16,000 a year, would permit an executive to be earning nearly £350,000. It cannot be right that if companies are getting public money, that they can be creamed off by a few at the top.
Well, the Labour leader also raised the idea of lower rates of corporation tax for companies with agreed pay ratios between the top and most junior employees, and higher income tax for high earners. Joining me now is the Deputy Editor of The Telegraph, Alistair Heath, and Dawn Foster, who's a writer with The Guardian. Let's talk about whether it's possible first, and then whether it's desirable. Alistair Heath, could it be done?
No, it can't be done because we're not a autarkic economy, right? So we'd be the only country in the world that suddenly massively limited pay for top earners. That would mean that no big company would possibly want to be located in the UK. Also, this idea that the government would not buy goods or services from companies that pay their CEOs a lot of money, then that means we can't buy cars from any company, we can't buy planes from any companies, we can't have defence contracts, because all of these large international companies, they won't suddenly decide to slash the pay of their top executives by 99%. So it's just literally impossible.
And you could get around it anyway, couldn't you, by paying in other forms?
I mean, yes, and of course then you could start getting around it, you could start paying people in equity, you could turn people into mini fake entrepreneurs so that they get capital gains rather than actual pay. There's lots of things you could do.
Do you think it's possible?
I think it could be. I think that every time one of these ideas is mooted, then people will just say that it's impossible, we can't do it, other countries don't. But I don't see why we shouldn't be the first country to try it.
Why would it make Britain a better place?
Because it would make,
to have this ratio?
Because it would make Britain more equal, and equal countries have better life expectancy, better health, they're happier economies, as well as being happier, full stop. We see that with the Nordic countries, but Britain has a massive inequality problem, especially at the top 1% compared to the rest of the population.
Who would it make happier?
It would make everybody happier. If you're earning more, if you're happier, if you're more secure, then of course you're happier.
Well, in reality, I think it'd make everybody unhappy, because I think it'd increase unemployment, it'd slash, investment, companies would retreat and shrink, there'd be no more entrepreneurship. I think it'd be a complete and utter disaster. I think it'd be a catastrophic policy.
Well, put aside your sort of scepticism about whether it's possible. Let's suppose it is possible. Do you accept that it's a desirable thing to curb the excesses?
I do not think that capping pay or enforcing compulsory compulsory ratios is a desirable policy. I'm against that. I don't think that should be. Because I see no purpose in it. I don't think it would work. I think what needs to happen is we need to maximise economic growth, we need to maximise jobs, we need to maximise pay for everybody, opportunities. That's what we need to do. And in fact, inequality in the UK is actually falling. There are figures out today from the ONS showing that inequality in the UK is down to the levels last seen in 1986.
That is true, isn't it, Dawn Foster? I mean, it was an odd day to announce this idea, the day that it shows inequality is getting smaller.
Yes, I mean, there are lots of measures of inequality, but what we have seen is a massive increase in the number of people who are claiming benefits while in work. The number of families in poverty who are in work now outstrips those who are not in work. So I think that actually it is hugely desirable to do it. I mean, cap and executive pay is very, very popular with the public, and if we get to a point where people are paid more, you know, for their jobs, then it means the government spend less money on housing benefit, on working family tax credits. The government spend less money on benefits full stop because people can support themselves.
It is likely to be popular, isn't it?
It may be popular in theory. Of course, if it were implemented and triggered economic catastrophe, then it wouldn't be popular. But in fact, there's no reason why capping or reducing the pay of the better off would increase the pay of the worse off, right? That, I think, is the fundamental
fallacy. Well, if you do it as a ratio, it mightn't it? Because in order to hold on to their higher salaries, they might decide to pay the people at the bottom a bit more.
I don't think it would happen that way at all. I think it would trigger increased automation, it would trigger simply moving investment abroad and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think it would achieve the outcome that people want to achieve.
I think it will. I think executives like their salaries too much, you know, under a ratio system to suddenly, you know, start paying themselves less. But also, automation can only go so far. I don't think we're going to see robot nurses, but I do think nurses should be paid more than very, very senior NHS managers. So, but
what is wrong with somebody earning £10 million a year? Is it a moral question, or is it a...
I think the problem is if somebody earns £10 million a year, but other people are earning only £10,000 a year, then it comes down to...
It's just obscene.
Yeah, it comes down to what you value. I don't think that nurses are worth less than CEOs. I think what they do is just as valuable, and I think actually there should be more equity in pay.
Well, I think the real issue here is low pay or limited opportunities or high levels of unemployment or insufficient pay which requires benefits and so on. I don't think that tackling these problems requires capping or reducing the pay of those who are not.
You see no obscenity in excessive pay or...
No, for me, it's not a moral question for me. The only moral question for me is how do you maximise economic growth? How do you maximise employment? How do you maximise opportunity for all? I want a society where everybody can gain, not just the rich, but I think that if you declare war on the rich, if you declare war on the better off, if you declare war on entrepreneurs and CEOs and so on, you impoverish the whole country, and it is the poor and the middle classes who lose the most.
Alistair Heath, Dawn Foster, thank you both very much. John.
After the break, she was in the right place at the right time. We look back at the career of Claire Hollingworth, the journalist who broke the news of the start of the World War II and who died today, aged 105. It was the scoop of the century. Claire Hollingworth was just a young reporter with the Daily Telegraph in 1939 when she spotted German troops massing near the Polish border. Her eyewitness account was the first the world knew of the Nazi invasion. After her death today, aged 105, our international editor Lindsay Hilsum looks back at her remarkable career.
I enjoy action. I enjoy being in a plane that's bombing something, or being on the ground in the desert when they're advancing.
Aged 27, Claire Hollingworth got the scoop of the 20th century. It was August 1939. Unbeknownst to the Poles or the British, 10 panzer divisions were massing on Germany's border with Poland. Claire saw them when she drove over the border in a borrowed British diplomatic vehicle, ostensibly to buy wine and aspirins. She'd been working as a reporter for the Daily Telegraph for just 3 weeks. The headline read, 1,000 tanks massed on Polish frontier, 10 divisions reported ready for swift stroke. Then she called the British Embassy secretary.
I was driving back along a valley and saw scores, if not hundreds, of tanks. 3 days later, on the 1st of September, the tanks rolled in. And I remember telephoning to Robin Hankey. And I put the telephone out of the window so he could hear the tanks rolling in.
More and more refugees have been arriving in Britain.
Before becoming a foreign correspondent, she worked for the Refugee Trust in Poland and Czechoslovakia. arranging British visas for thousands of Jews and leftists escaping the Nazis, risking her own life to save theirs. It gave her a taste for being where history was happening. In 1946, she narrowly escaped death when the King David Hotel in Jerusalem was blown up in a Zionist terror attack. Then, more scoops.
On the subject of friendship, I prefer to say as little as possible.
Kim Philby. In 1963, Claire realised he wasn't just a chum and a fellow reporter in Beirut, but an enemy agent. One evening he was meant to dine with her. He had in fact escaped to Russia. Her then employers, The Guardian, spiked her story for fear of MI6. She was the first to interview the Shah of Iran when he came to power in 1941, and the last when he fled to Morocco after the Iranian Revolution. The young liberals who supported his overthrow, she thought, might regret it when the Ayatollahs decreed they could no longer have a gin and tonic. By the time she reported the Vietnam War, she'd seen a lot of conflict, and sometimes gave American generals the benefit of her opinion.
I'd seen a lot of wars, and sometimes I said, why didn't you do that, or why didn't you do that? I admit I did. I shouldn't have done. When I first went in, I thought the Americans would win easily. And then I realized there were all sorts of problems with the locals, and they hadn't got the wholehearted sympathy of the population.
When the weeds in her Paris garden annoyed her, she used a flamethrower to control them. She never had children because being a war correspondent was more interesting. Happy birthday, dear Claire. She celebrated her 105th birthday at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong, where she lived for her last 30 years. By then she was fading. But 5 years earlier, aged 100, when asked where she would most like to go, she replied, "The most dangerous place. It always makes a good story."
Well, I'm joined now by Con Coughlin, who is the defence editor of the Daily Telegraph and who worked with Claire Hollingworth. I mean, that's pretty good. I wonder where she will be buried.
I assume she'll be buried in Hong Kong. She's lived out in the Far East for probably half her life now.
Well, Hong Kong's stirring, but we can hope that it's not going to become the most dangerous place in the world, which is what she was asking for. But, I mean, when you joined the Telegraph, I mean, she was presumably a remarkable figure, but in the background, not somebody that you would come across on a daily basis.
No, when I joined the Telegraph in 1980, I was the lowest of the low. And she was one of the legends of the paper. But even then, if I was doing something interesting, and fairly soon I was going to places like Beirut and covering wars, and the moment I got back, it would be Claire debriefing me. You know, who did I talk to? Which faction's in control? And she was always wanted to be on top of the detail. And as I said, she's not the sort of woman you ever said no to.
Now, she continued to file copy, as we like to put it, very late into her life.
Yes, well, I think probably until she was about 85, so until about 20 years ago. About then, her eyesight did start to fail, and which made her very sort of very agitated that she couldn't do the things she wanted to do. I remember having lunch with her on one of her visits to London, and she said, "Con, every morning I wake up and I feel like an 18-year-old girl, but of course my body is not that of an 18-year-old, and I can't do what I want to do all the time." But her enthusiasm to know what was going on and her interest was sustained right throughout her life.
I mean, inevitably one does raise the question of gender, because it was extremely rare to get any number of women out there in the field. I mean, how did she do it?
It was quite remarkable when you look back. I mean, she genuinely was a trailblazer. There were very few women on the front line, particularly in the 1930s, and particularly when the Nazis were invading Poland. But it was just in her DNA that the fact that she was a woman was not in any way, did not in any way make a difference to men. And frankly, heaven help any man who tried to sort of give her a helping hand or open a door for her in Sarajevo or Beijing or anywhere else for that matter.
Does she have a legacy of young women working at the Telegraph?
Well, we do have a lot of women reporters. Of course, the game has changed a lot now. I wonder sometimes what Claire would have made of the digital age we live in, but I think the spirit is there.
Con Coughlin, thank you very much for coming in. And that's it from us tonight. That's Channel 4 News. We'll be back at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. But for tonight, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.